So as a non-American, I sometimes sit back with bewilderment, maybe, at what is the American political spectacle. Because it rises to the level of like South Park episode satire on a fairly regular basis. And a recent controversy, I would say, certainly meets this standard of absurdity. So in the aftermath of the fallout that Budweiser beer was experiencing among conservative patrons, a new beer company called Ultra Right Beer tried to position itself as a natural alternative. And to introduce itself to its consumer audience, it launched a marketing campaign with a pinup calendar called the Conservative Dads Real Women of America 2024 calendar as its centerpiece. And as you'd probably expect, many self-identifying conservatives objected to the idea that a pinup calendar is at all compatible with what it means to be a conservative. But amazingly, astonishingly, this objection was met with opposition by other so-called conservatives, including the high-profile women who posed for the calendar and who are positioned themselves as apparently conservative influencers. All of which highlighted, at least again for me, the fact that if you peek under the label conservative, you will immediately be confronted with a conspicuous divide between those who might be described as social conservatives and those who describe themselves as more like classical liberals or libertarians, but all of whom are routinely described, at least by the media, as conservatives. Social conservatives are often the more religiously pious, family values-oriented crowd who are more concerned about political and legislative policies that tend to compete with the interests of the family. And the classical liberals are those who are more concerned with freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and freedom to stare at bikini girls in your garage, apparently. And it all raises an obvious question for someone like me, and maybe you as well, because I might be more inclined to identify myself as a conservative if it wasn't for these kinds of absurd controversies that I would then have to be associated with. The question is, what is a conservative, and what exactly is it that we are conserving? And I think it's important to take stock of fundamental questions like this from time to time, even if it's motivated by something as ridiculous as a beer company trying to make a quick buck off of half-naked women who actually believe they are leading conservatives. Because in case you haven't noticed, the left is very, very well positioned. They have gained a lot of ground. Our education institutions, the ones we rely on to form capable citizens, are overrun with leftist biases. Our media, which used to be something that we would rely on to provide us impartial reporting on current events, is now more often a mouthpiece for left-wing propaganda. And our IT companies even are largely represented by leftist groupthink. If conservatives want to have any hope of restoring some measure of sanity to our culture and our polity, then we have to have a more unified vision of how it is that we should organize ourselves as a society. Because after all, a very wise man once said that a house divided cannot stand. And so for my modest part, I'd like to draw attention to something that I think might help reconcile these two factions, which is that for as much as they might disagree on what is true and what it is that we should be advancing, I think that they can all agree on what it is that is false and what we should be resisting as the greatest threat to a flourishing society, which is, I would argue, the woke ideology. And so what exactly is that? We hear that word all the time, and you could say a lot about it, and books have been written in attempts to do just that. But a key explanatory ingredient in wokeism is the insistence on treating and interpreting all questions of justice through a binary lens of oppressor and oppressed. Because this lens then becomes a very convenient tool for knowing who to advocate for and who to resist with that revolutionary enthusiasm. So people of color are oppressed, and naturally white people are oppressors. Workers, gay people, and women are all oppressed, while employers, heteronormative people, and men are all oppressors, of course. We're all well acquainted, I think, with this narrative. And the aim in all of these classifications is to dismantle the structures of oppression and overthrow and even marginalize those who oppress. I think that's what it means to be woke. And if that's accurate, then we should also be able to trace this pedigree and its inspiration in Karl Marx's theories about class struggle and the substructure and the superstructure. And of course, Marxism and communism are another mutual adversary of whatever factions find themselves under the label conservative. So let's return back to what the aim of wokeism as one of Marx's illegitimate children is. It's to lay low anything that is hierarchical in society in the name of equity and liberation. It wants to completely level the playing field so that nobody has any more power or privilege than anyone else. But even if that's attractive to you, think about what that means, because politics is a question of how we organize ourselves as a society. It's how the many individuals decide to cooperate together to accomplish more than what they could otherwise apart. But organization is, by definition, hierarchical. Let me give you an example, because I know this isn't obvious to most people. An organism, like a living thing, is the organization of parts into a living composition. We're composed of like organs and muscular skeletal structures, a nervous system, and other varied body parts that all contribute to a well-ordered and well-functioning whole. And because of that whole organization, an organism is also hierarchical. Different parts interact with and even govern other parts, all of which interact with and are governed by a universal organ, which is the head or the brain. To disorganize that hierarchy of an organism is to actually kill the organism. To revolutionize an organism and create absolute equity among all its parts, you'd have to do something like put it through a meat grinder, forgive the illustration, so that everything is equally distributed and nothing has any more power over anything else. But that, of course, destroys the organism. Another example of this would be the files you have on your computer. You might be one of those people who I can't stand, who just dumps everything on your desktop. That's an equitable file structure, utterly without organization or hierarchy. But it's also a very poorly performing file structure. By contrast, a well-organized file structure is one in which files are placed in folders based on their relationships and the purposes that they serve. And then those folders are placed into other folders until the whole thing is inevitably organized into a hierarchy. And I would argue that a conservative should be someone who is committed to a well-ordered and organized society in which a diversity of people embrace roles and functions suited to their diverse strengths and abilities, in which they take on different responsibilities, adversities, and therefore rewards as well. And the basic, fundamental building block of a well-organized society is the family, a dad and a mom and their children living and working together in harmony. And though our institutions and media have been desperately trying to disparage the traditional nuclear family as something contemptible, study after study confirms its necessity in helping to make a society flourish. And there are so many that I could highlight, but one that exemplifies this fact was a sexuality study done by J.D. Unwin, who was an Oxford anthropologist. He studied how restraint or unrestraint with respect to sexuality influenced the general prosperity of society. And after studying over 80 civilizations, he found that the ones that practiced chastity before marriage and monogamy within marriage outperformed their counterparts in measures of science, literature, art, architecture, technology, and just about anything else that you can measure their prosperity by. So if you want to do something like make your country great again, you have to start by fanatically protecting the interests of the family and resisting anything that competes with those interests. So what most competes with the interests of the family, you might be asking? The answer is the sexual revolution, with all of its doctrines and all of its practices. And while there are a cast of characters that you could look to as those who instigated the sexual revolution, which is aptly named as a revolution for its Marxist DNA, the person who literally wrote the book on it was a psychologist named Wilhelm Reich, who was a member of the Frankfurt School, which you may have heard of, which was a notorious cabal of academics and intellectuals fanatically committed to like aggravating the resentments of certain members of society against other members of society in the hopes of inaugurating a Marxist revolution in the United States. Reich, along with Marx and Engels, saw the family as a pillar of hierarchy and patriarchy, which of course is another thing that wokeism is constantly denouncing, which was like a bulwark of oppression that had to be dismantled. And he knew that the liberation of the libido would usher in all manner of practices that would jeopardize its stability, like pornography and promiscuity, contraception, abortion, and on and on. And he wasn't wrong. The family has been utterly destabilized since all of these things have been introduced since the 20th century, and society along with it. So if a conservative is someone who wants a great society, a well-ordered society, one that is far more likely to grow and to prosper, one that is organized and not reduced to chaos in the service of a fallacious conception of equality, I would argue then that a conservative is someone who must recognize the indispensable position of the family and its interest in that society. And anything that competes with the fidelity of spouses, and especially husbands, like, oh, I don't know, someone who isn't his wife posing provocatively in a calendar marketed directly at him based on his identity as a conservative, that is incompatible and actually, I would argue, an enemy of what it means to be a conservative. Which is why anyone claiming to be a conservative while promoting or exemplifying sexual promiscuity, no-fault divorce, contraception, same-sex marriage, pornography, and sex education for children outside of the family, and most often in opposition to the family or competition with the family, is not and should not be considered a conservative. Can I indulge your patience for a second and ask for some help with my channel? I don't do this kind of work full time, that is like YouTube production. I do try to hold down a full-time job, or actually two in my case, to keep this whole thing going. And that means a sacrifice of time and therefore income to make all of this possible. Now, compared to the number of viewers that I get on a weekly basis, a very small fraction of them are offering their support to keep this whole thing going. And in fact, a few have offered to make even bigger sacrifices, but I would much rather that the many contribute small amounts than a few making large amount contributions. And honestly, if the 10 to 20,000 people who watch my videos on a weekly basis and who apparently get some value out of them just like once a year drop $5 into the tip jar, then we'd be covered in our expenses for the year and we'd be all set. And I'm counting on the assumption that a once a year $5 contribution or sacrifice is realistic for most people. So if that's persuasive and you do want to help out, there's a couple ways that you can make a contribution. You can go to my website by visiting brianholdsworth.ca/support, or you can join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and opportunities to interact with me, as well as other like-minded members of the community, by visiting brianholdsworth.locals.com, and both links will be available in the description.